Here we are. We're here for the third part of how to stalk your mind, how to really observe what's going on in your mental space. So the first week of November, we worked on thoughts, patterns of thoughts, rabbit holes, stories. Last week we worked on belief structures, and today we're going to work on judgments, expectations, and conditions that our mind puts on things. So these are a little bit more advanced of observations. So I just want to reiterate, if you are new to this kind of work, you might be working on this stuff that we talked about in the first episode for a little bit of time, and then you can start to move on to belief structures. Judgments and expectations and conditions, they tend to be a bit more deep in the conscious or sometimes in the subconscious. And I just wanted to throw that out there to set some reasonable expectations for you all. So that way you're not feeling some kind of way for like, I don't know what she's talking about. I can't do what she's talking about, right? And some of you are going to be real good at this, and everybody's mind works a little bit different. Our minds are different. Our ability to observe our minds are different. All right, so let's talk about judgments. So last week we talked about belief structures. Now, judgments are also structures of the mind, but they're less about what's going on in the world and what's available in the world, and they're more about how they dictate behavior. So judgments help us to stay safe physically, socially, or emotionally. All right. So very rarely in my coaching do I have to work with anybody around physical safety judgments. Most people that I'm working with have businesses or whatever, and there's no physical danger. So I will just say that's not coming up too often. The social judgments and emotional judgments come up a lot. So let's talk about emotional judgments first. When we're learning how to be alive and we're a little kid and we're having really big feelings, a lot of times we learn that certain feelings aren't safe, right? Now, sometimes when we're a kid and we have big feelings, we're going to get dismissed. We're going to get sent away. We're going to get in trouble. Now, sometimes, obviously, that doesn't happen. Sometimes we're going to be held through our feelings and we're going to be tended to. But for many of us, we'll have interactions where if we're angry or if we're like real stank, we have an attitude, we're in an emotional state, like we're going to get snapped at or get in trouble. Now, what this means when you're a really small kid is that these emotions are not safe because they separate me from my caregiver, or I get in trouble, or they make my survival harder, essentially. So how this really shows up is that if the emotions that we're not willing to feel could be a potential effect of certain actions that we could take, we're going to have a real hard time taking those actions. So let me just give you an example to ground this. So let's just say for my career, the thing that I want to do is speak on big stages. Right? So I want to get up, I want to speak at big conferences in front of 1,000 people or whatever. Now, let's just say that one time in, grade school, I had to give a presentation in front of the class and I messed it up real bad. Something happened. And that emotion, being seen created such a bad emotion for me. And I never moved through that emotion. I never got the emotional support that I needed to really process that emotion properly. So I just have this lingering story. So we talked about stories in the first episode in November. So this emotional, wound is still there. So today when I go speak on stages, it's going to remind my body about that time in 4th grade. Right? And chances are I'm going to not send my pitch. I'm going to get sick the day of the speaking. I'm going to not do that speaking engagement because to me that's emotionally unsafe, right? Now, so much of the work that I do with my advanced clients, like my clients in Limitless Wealth, my private clients, is really around expanding that emotional range, learning how to process hard emotions, things like that. But so for today, if we can notice that mental structure that says, all right, well, these judgments are not safe, will then keep that emotional charge alive in the body, and then it will impact how we behave. It will impact our actions. Then we have our social judgments. So social judgments are going to be like who you need to be okay in the group. Now what's very, very interesting is that social judgments, social conditioning can be very, very conflicting. All right, very, very conflicted. So like, let's just say you needed to be a certain person at school to fit in, to be part of the crowd, to know where you belong socially. And in your friend group, you had to be somebody really, really different. And now you're a mom and the expectations you have of motherhood are really, really different. And sometimes these places can make a crisscross, and we can have expectations for ourselves that are basically impossible to meet. That's a very real thing. So judgments. So these judgments, again, they're helping us to stay safe either physically, socially, or emotionally. So starting to observe judgments, the way that I'm typically looking for judgments is when when I'm listening to clients talk, sometimes I'll see a resistance. They're like, I know I should speak on this stage, but like they'll look like their butthole's clenched and their jaw is tight and they're holding their breath a little bit. And so they're in resistance around that. So that resistance is their emotions, kind of putting up a little bit of a barrier, to protect them from this. All right. Another thing I'll notice is if we are thinking about taking an action that feels bad to us, sometimes we'll justify it. Right. So I always know that a client has a tough relationship with money when she justifies her spending to me. She'll be like, well, I bought this new shirt because it was on sale and it was this and that and it was such a good deal and da da da. And I'm like, she's justifying this purchase even though because she thinks it was wrong or bad, but I don't think it was wrong or bad. So if she's justifying this, to me, it's like she's got a judgment that either buying shirts is wrong or spending money on herself is wrong or buying silk is wrong or whatever the judgment is. We'd have to ask some questions to follow that out, but there'll be a justification. And then if you take action that would put you on the wrong side of your judgment, very likely you're going to feel guilty. All right, so this is how I observe. These are the clues for judgments because judgments are a bit harder to see than belief structures. All right, so guilt, resistance, and justification. Now, the social conditioning that we get is often the biggest deal when it comes to business, success, wealth. So women are not necessarily socially conditioned to be providers. We're not necessarily socially conditioned to have or hold big amounts of money. Actually, there's just something floating around the internet. It's just like 50 years has passed since women were able to get a mortgage without a man's cosign. It was like the 70s before women were able to get bank accounts. And so women are relatively new to having full financial autonomy, right? And so men are socially conditioned to be providers, to ask for more. There's a lot of social conditioning and expectations that are just different of women. Right? And so for most of my clients, the sets of social conditioning that do the most damage in business are both the good girl and the independent woman. And if you have them both, it creates like a very double-sided set of judgments where it's like on one side, I'm people-pleasing, I'm over-delivering, I'm undercharging, the good girl. And on the other side is I'm not asking for help, I'm doing it all myself, I can't count on people, right? And if you have both of those sets of social conditioning, it's very, very exhausting. They're not really but having both sets is not really conducive to wealth. Also, neither actually is very conducive to wealth. Good girls burn out and get resentful, and the independent woman also burns out and gets resentful for different reasons. So we want to start to observe these social conditionings, and you're going to mostly do this by just looking at how you grew up and what was expected and what you think is normal. Right? So these are kind of how you can start to observe where's the social conditioning here. What do I watch? What did I see my mom, my grandmother do? Whatever else. You can start to see this. So that's how you can start to observe your judgments. Expectations, you can usually ask yourself to find out, well, what do I expect to happen here? Right? If I'm going to do this thing, what do I expect to happen here? How do I expect this to go? And if you ask yourself the question, this is a good journal, like this is good work to do in your journal, you can usually see you can see where your expectations are. And then from there, you can kind of take it to the process that I taught you in last week's episode around beliefs, right? Is this true? Why do I think this? Does it have to be like this? Could I expect something else? More or less, expectations are just going to be based on old truths that you have. So that's going to be another layer of observation. But your expectations are going to be really important in how you see things happening. Because a lot of times, the expectations we have or the expectations we don't have can really be, I call it like a cock block with the universe. It's like the universe is trying to give us that, but since we weren't expecting it or we weren't open to it or we were expecting something else, even if you, like a lot of times you can miss things completely that are outside of your expectations. So that's it. Now, conditions. Conditions for success are interesting because many people will have an unconscious list of expectation or conditions that they need to meet to have a certain thing, right? So let's say if I want to make $1 million, I might believe I need to work hard. I might need to believe believe that it's going to require sacrifice. I might believe that it's going to cost me something. I might believe that I'm going to have to turn into a greedy capitalist pig, right? And so oftentimes we'll have these conditions that we think are required to get something done. Now, they're usually, once questioned, sometimes there's a practical thing that is perfect and makes sense, right? Like if you want to be a doctor, one of the conditions is that you're going to have to go to med school. Like, facts, just like that's how that goes. But sometimes you might also believe that med school's really hard and I have to work all night. I have to stay up all night studying to be able to do it. And those sorts of conditions can often do a lot of crazy making for people, and they're not necessarily true. So if you're observing the conditions that you have for something, I would just ask myself, what does it need to take for this to be a success? And do that in your journal when you have time and space. And what you get there is going to show you the conditions that you're working with. And, from there you can then go back and start to question them and see if they're true, see if, you're to those conditions changing. And this gives you a lot of power and authority in how you get things done. All right. So next week is our last week on observing the mind. And actually, we're going to start to move into thoughts and sensations and stories and emotions and how these things all play together, how our mindset leads our emotional state and why that matters. I will get to see you next week. Bye, everybody.